The new paint in the apartment smelled like a lie. It was a cheap, flat white, slapped on to cover the scuffs and sorrows of the last person who lived here. It couldn't cover the silence, though. Nothing could. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, physical thing, pressing in on me from the four identical walls of my rented one-bedroom. Back in the house on Sycamore Street, there was always noise. The groan of the old furnace kicking on, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Even when the house was empty, it felt full. This place just felt empty. I looked down at the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen. I'd read the message from Leo a dozen times already, as if reading it again would change the words, soften the blow. Midterms are killing me. You're the strongest guy I know, you'll be fine. Talk later. The strongest guy I know. The words should have made me proud. They used to. Now they just felt like a cage. A man isn't allowed to be weak. A father isn't allowed to fall. I was Mike Sullivan. I fixed things. Broken down engines, leaky faucets, wobbly kitchen chairs. I had spent my entire life fixing things for other people. But I didn't know how to fix this. This hollowed-out feeling in my chest, this cold dread that settled in my bones. I closed my eyes and instead of the blank white wall in front of me, I saw my garage. Sullivan's Auto. I could smell its sharp tang of gasoline, the sweet scent of antifreeze, the comforting aroma of hot metal and motor oil. I could hear the rhythmic clank of a wrench on a lug nut, the hiss of the pneumatic lift. That was my church. That was my kingdom. The place where my hands, calloused and stained, made sense of the world. Now, some other man was working under that roof. My roof. It all started 7 months ago, on a Tuesday that felt like any other. It started with a single piece of paper, delivered in a crisp, expensive-looking envelope that felt completely out of place in our simple metal mailbox. It started with a dream. Not my dream. His. And that made all the difference. The sun in Cleveland that spring was a shy visitor. It would peek out for an hour, warming the asphalt enough to make the air smell of tar, and then retreat behind. "Hey, Dad," his voice echoed slightly in the cavernous space of the garage. I slid out from under the truck on the creeper, wiping my greasy hands on a red rag that had seen better decades. "Hey, kid. How was school?" "It was school," he said, shrugging. That was his standard answer. For Leo, high school was just a waiting room, a place he had to be before his real life could start. He dropped his backpack by the door, the thud of textbooks hitting the concrete floor. He was a good kid. Smart as a whip. He got that from his mother. Emily. She'd been the reader, the thinker. My hands knew engines, her mind knew everything else. Leo poked at a tire waiting to be patched. "Anything I can do to help?" I almost smiled. He asked that sometimes, out of a sense of duty, I think. He was as coordinated with a wrench as I was with a computer. A lost cause. "Nah, I'm almost done with this beast. Just stubborn bolts." He nodded, already pulling his phone from his pocket, his thumbs starting to fly across the screen. He lived in a different world, one made of light and information. My world was made of steel and grease and sweat. I never resented it. In fact, I was proud. I worked with my hands so he wouldn't have to. Every busted knuckle, every hour of overtime, was a paving stone on the road to his future, a future far away from the grime under my fingernails. "Mail's on the kitchen counter," I said, my voice a little gruff. "Bills and junk, mostly." He gave a distracted, "Okay," and wandered out of the garage, back toward the house. The small, 2-story house on Sycamore Street. I bought it with Emily 20 years ago. We didn't have much, just a down payment scraped together from my job at a dealership and her salary as a part-time librarian. But it was ours. I laid the tile in the kitchen myself, a crooked job that Emily always said gave it character. I planted the oak tree in the front yard the day Leo was born. Its branches now brushed against his bedroom window. Every square inch of that place was soaked in memories. Her memories. Our memories. After she was gone, the house became my anchor. The cancer took her fast, a storm that blew in and tore our world apart. For a long time after, the silence in the house was a predator. But slowly, Leo and I learned to live in it. We filled the quiet with our own routines. My early mornings, his late nights studying. The smell of my coffee and the glow of his desk lamp. The house held us. It kept the memory of her alive. I'd talk to her picture on the mantelpiece sometimes. Look at him, Em. He's so tall. You'd be so proud. I finished with the truck, cleaned my tools, and washed my hands until the skin was raw, but the grease never fully came out. It was a part of me. I walked into the kitchen, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner, the kind Emily always used, faintly in the air. Leo was standing at the counter, completely still, staring at a piece of paper. Not a bill. It was thick, creamy white paper, with an embossed seal at the top. The envelope it came from lay discarded next to it. "What's that?" I asked, my heart giving a little lurch. "We've been waiting, but you're never really prepared." Leo looked up at me. His eyes, the same deep brown as his mother's, were wide with a mixture of terror and pure, unadulterated joy. He couldn't speak. He just slid the letter across the counter toward me. I picked it up. My hands felt clumsy holding something so important. I read the first line. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, on behalf of the admissions committee, it is my great pleasure to offer you a place in the freshman class at Boston University." I didn't need to read the rest. A wave of pride so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet washed over me. Boston. A real deal, big shot university on the East Coast. A place I only knew from movies. My son. My Leo. He had done it. "Well, I breathed out, a slow grin spreading across my face. I looked at Leo, and he finally broke into a smile so wide it looked like it hurt. I pulled him into a hug, a rare thing for us. He was stiff for a second, then relaxed into it. I clapped him on the back, hard. "You did it, kid. You actually did it." We were both laughing. The kitchen, which a moment ago had just been a kitchen, was now a victory chamber. The air crackled with possibility. For that one perfect moment, anything seemed possible. I saw his whole life stretching out in front of him, a shining path leading away from Cleveland, away from the smell of oil and the gray winters. It was everything I had ever wanted for him. Then, as my eyes scanned down the page, past the congratulations and the welcome speeches, I saw the other section. The one titled Tuition and Fees. The numbers didn't seem real. They were abstract, like the distance to the moon. Room and board, tuition, student activity fees. I read the total at the bottom, and the joyous air in the room seemed to rush out, leaving a vacuum in its place. The smile on my face tightened. Leo must have seen the change in my expression, because his own smile faltered. There's a financial aid package," he said quickly, pointing to a second sheet of paper. "They gave me a scholarship. A pretty good one." I picked it up. A scholarship. Grants. It was a generous offer, more money than I made in a year. But when you subtracted it from the total cost, the number left over was still staggering. It was a mountain. It wasn't just big, it was a different geography. It was a number that didn't exist in my world. My world was made of $100 repair jobs and carefully managed credit card debt. That number was a mansion on a street I wasn't allowed to drive down. The silence returned to the kitchen. But this time, it wasn't the comfortable silence of routine. It was the heavy, awkward silence of a dream colliding with reality. "It's too much," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. The light had gone out of his eyes. He wouldn't look at me. He was looking at the worn linoleum on the floor I'd promised Emily I'd replace for years. "It's okay, Dad. I can go to Cleveland State. It's a good school, too." I watched him. I saw the slump in his shoulders, the way he was trying to protect me from the disappointment, a burden no 18-year-old should have to carry. He was willing to shrink his dream to fit our bank account. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. A quiet, fierce resolve. I had spent my life fixing things that were broken. This was just another problem to solve. A bigger one, sure. But the principle was the same. You look at the problem, you find the right tool, and you get to work. I looked around the kitchen, at the chipped countertops and the old oak cabinets I'd refinished myself. I looked through the doorway into the living room, at the worn armchair where I sat every night, at the mantelpiece with Emily's picture. I thought of the garage out back, the business I had built from nothing. They weren't just things. They were assets. They were tools. "No," I said. The word came out firm, stronger than I felt. "No. You're not going to Cleveland State." Leo looked up, confused. "But, Dad, there's no way." I put my hand on his shoulder. I looked him straight in the eye. "You earned this, Leo. Your mother, she would have wanted you to have this. Don't worry about the money. I'll figure it out. I always do." He searched my face, looking for a doubt that I refused to show him. He found none. Slowly, tentatively, the hope returned to his eyes. "Really?" "Really," I said, forcing a confident smile. "Now go on, call your friends. Brag a little. You deserve it." He hesitated for another second, then a real, genuine smile broke out again. He grabbed the letter and bolted upstairs to his room, and I could hear his excited voice on the phone before the door even closed. I stood alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet again. I picked up the financial statement, the numbers mocking me from the page. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a clue. All I had was a promise. And as I stood there, in the house that held my entire life, an idea began to form. A terrible, necessary idea. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a thought so disloyal I tried to shove it away. But it wouldn't leave. It grew louder, clearer, until it was the only sound I could hear. The house. The garage. My best friend, Dave Kowalski, who ran a plumbing supply store, had a saying, "You can't fix a busted pipe with a hammer, Mike. You gotta use the right tool for the job." I looked at Emily's picture on the mantel. Her smile was kind, understanding. "What would you do, Em?" I asked her in my head. And in the quiet of my heart, I thought I heard her answer. "Whatever it takes for our boy. The right tool for the job." It was going to cost me everything. But for his dream, it felt like a price I had to pay. I folded the letter and put it back on the counter. The decision was made. I just had to figure out how to live with it. The next few weeks were a blur of secret phone calls and quiet meetings. I became a spy in my own life. I'd wait for Leo to leave for school, then I'd call a real estate agent, my voice low as if the walls themselves might be listening. The agent, a woman named Sharon with a voice that was too cheerful for the business at hand, came over one afternoon. She walked through the rooms with a clipboard, complimenting the good bones and the charming, vintage feel. To her, it was a property, a listing, a set of dimensions and features. To me, every creak in the floorboards was a lullaby I'd sung to Leo as a baby. The pencil marks on the doorframe in the hallway weren't just measurements, they were a timeline of my son's life, from a wobbly toddler to a young man who now stood taller than me. "The market is hot right now, Mr. Sullivan," Sharon said, tapping her pen on her clipboard. "Especially with the attached workshop. A hobbyist or a small business owner would snap this up. We can list it for a very competitive price." The word list felt like a punch to the gut. It meant putting a price tag on 20 years of my life. On Emily's garden, now mostly weeds, but I could still see where she'd planted the tulips. On the worn spot on the stairs where I sat every Christmas morning, watching Leo's face light up. And the business? I asked, my voice hoarse. The garage itself? Well, the equipment is older, but it's solid. We could sell it as a package deal with the property, or liquidate the assets separately. Depends on how quickly you need the capital. Capital. That's what it was to her. To me, it was the hydraulic lift I'd bought with the first big check I ever got. It was the set of German-made socket wrenches Emily had given me for our 10th anniversary, insisting that I deserved the best. Each tool had a story. Now they were just assets to be liquidated. I told Leo the first was refinancing. It was a half-truth that felt like a whole lie. He was so wrapped up in the excitement of his future choosing his classes, buying extra-long twin sheets online, connecting with future classmates on social media that he just nodded and accepted it. The relief on his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. He trusted me completely. And I was betraying that trust by hiding the true scale of the sacrifice. But how could I tell him? How could I place the weight of selling his childhood home on his shoulders before he'd even left it? It was a father's job to carry the heavy things. This was the heaviest thing I'd ever carried. My best friend, Dave, knew something was up. He saw it in the way I stared off into the distance while we were supposed to be watching the game, in the way I barely touched the beer he handed me. Dave and I had been friends since we were kids. He was a big man with a booming laugh and a no-nonsense approach to life. He'd been my best man at my wedding and a pallbearer at my wife's funeral. He could read me better than anyone. One evening, he came over with a pizza and a six-pack, his usual Friday night ritual. He found me in the garage, not working, just standing there, running my hand over the cool metal of the lathe. "All right, Mike, out with it," he said, setting the pizza box on my workbench. "You look like you just ran over your own dog." I tried to play it cool. "Just tired. Long week." "Bull," he said, popping the top on 2 beers and handing one to me. "You've been just tired for 3 weeks. Your eyes have more bags than the grocery store. What's going on?" I took a long pull of the beer, letting the cold liquid steel my nerves. I couldn't lie to Dave. I leaned against the workbench, the same bench where he and I had once tried to build a go-kart, a disastrous project that ended with a small fire and a lot of laughter. "Leo got into Boston University," I said. Dave's face broke into a huge grin. "No kidding. That's fantastic. My God, Mike, you must be busting your buttons. Boston. Em would be over the moon." "She would," I agreed, a lump forming in my throat. "So we should be celebrating. Why do you look like you're planning a funeral?" I took a deep breath. "The cost, Dave. It's astronomical. The aid they gave him, it's great, but it barely makes a dent." Dave's smile faded. He understood numbers. He ran his own business. He knew. "How bad?" I told him the number. He let out a low whistle and took a swig of his beer, his eyes scanning the garage, the tools on the walls, the hulking shapes of cars under tarps. He was putting the pieces together. His gaze finally landed on me, his expression turning serious. "Mike, what are you thinking of doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I'm selling it," I said, the words finally out in the open. "The house. The garage. Everything." Dave stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. I expected him to be surprised, maybe even impressed by the gesture. Instead, his face darkened with anger. "Are you out of your mind?" he finally exploded, his voice echoing in the garage. "You can't be serious. This is your home, Mike. This was Emily's home. Her memories are in the damn drywall. And the business? You built this place from nothing. It's who you are. It's just bricks and mortar, Dave, I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Don't you give me that crap, he shot back, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. This is your life's work. You're going to throw it all away. For what? So a kid can go to some fancy school he doesn't need to go to. Cleveland State is a great school. He could live at home. It's not just a fancy school. There are other ways. Loans. He can work. You don't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, Mike. That's not love, that's martyrdom, and it never ends well. He's my son. I yelled, the words raw with a mix of love and desperation. It's my job to give him the best possible chance. We stood there, breathing heavily in the sudden silence, the smell of pizza and beer. He doesn't know, does he? He asked softly. I shook my head. How can I tell him? He'd refuse to go. He'd carry that guilt for the rest of his life. So you're going to carry it instead? Dave ran a hand over his face. Mike, this is a mistake. A huge mistake. What happens after he's gone? What do you have left? I'll have his future, I said, but the words felt hollow, even. You won't be fine, Dave said, his voice pleading. You're not a guy who works for a boss. You're not a guy who lives in an apartment. You're Mike Sullivan. You own Sullivan's Auto. You live in the house you bought with your wife. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty. You sell this place, and you're selling yourself along with it. His words stayed with me long after he left, the half-eaten pizza cold on the workbench. He was wrong. He had to be wrong. I was doing the right thing. I was doing what any good father would do. I was sacrificing for my child. It was noble. It was necessary. The "for sale" sign went up a week later. I hammered it into the front lawn myself, next to the oak tree. The sharp, metallic sound of the hammer hitting the post felt like a final judgment. Leo was out with his friends. I wanted it done before he got home. I told him the sign was just for the refinancing appraisal, a bank formality. He barely glanced at it. His world was already in Boston. The offers came in fast, just as Sharon had predicted. A young couple, a mechanic looking to start his own business. They loved it. They loved the character, the big yard, the solid feel of the workshop. They made a good offer, a clean offer. All cash. I accepted it. The closing date was set for late August, a week before Leo was due to leave. The finality of it was a physical weight. I walked through the house at night, after Leo was asleep, touching the walls, memorizing the way the moonlight fell across the living room floor. I sat in Emily's favorite armchair, trying to absorb the last vestiges of her presence. I was a ghost in my own home, haunting the rooms before I had even left. Packing was the hardest part. What do you keep when your life has to fit into a dozen cardboard boxes? I sorted through 20 years of accumulation. Old photos, Leo's kindergarten drawings, Emily's collection of teacups. Each object was a landmine of memory. I found a Father's Day card Leo had made for me when he was 7. It was a crude drawing of me under a car, with the words, "My dad can fix anything," written in crayon. I had to sit down on the floor of the dusty attic, my breath catching in my chest. I kept the card. I kept the photos. I kept Emily's favorite teacup. Most of the rest, the furniture, the books, the life we had built, was sold in an estate sale. I watched strangers haggle over my dining room table. I saw a woman by the lamp that used to sit by Emily's side of the bed. It felt like a violation. The day before Leo left, the check from the sale cleared. I transferred the bulk of Ida life-altering sum of money into a new account I'd set up for his tuition. What was left over was just enough to cover the first few months' rent on a small apartment I'd found across town and maybe a security deposit. It wasn't much. It was a fresh start from below zero. That night, we had one last dinner at the old kitchen table, which was now covered in a moving blanket because it belonged to someone else. I made his favorite, spaghetti and meatballs, from a recipe Emily had taught me. We didn't talk much. The empty spaces in the room spoke for us. "It's going to be weird, huh?" Leo said, pushing a meatball around his plate. "This place being someone else's." "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "A little weird." "Thanks, Dad," he said suddenly, looking at me. "For making this happen. The refinancing and everything. I know it must have been a lot of work." "It's nothing," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Anything for you, kid." The next day, we drove to the airport. The car was quiet. What was there left to say? I'd already given him everything. We stood at the security gate, the departure board flashing with cities that seemed a world away. He looked so young, so excited, and so terrified. He hugged me, a quick, almost awkward hug. "I'll call you when I land," he said. "You better," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Work hard. But have some fun, too." "I will, Dad." He turned and walked toward the gate. He didn't look back. I stood there and watched him until he was just a speck in the crowd, swallowed up by the promise of his new life. I drove back not to the house on Sycamore Street, but to a sterile apartment complex on the other side of town. I used a key that felt foreign in my hand to open a door that led to a small, empty room that smelled of new paint. I dropped my keys on the counter. The sound echoed in the silence. It was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. Dave was wrong, I told myself again. But as the sun set on my first night in that empty apartment, a cold, hard knot of fear tightened in my stomach. What if he was right? The first few weeks were a lesson in loneliness. I had structured my entire life around two things, my son and my work. Now, both were gone. The rhythms that had defined my days for 2 decades vanished overnight. I no longer woke up to the smell of coffee brewing for 2, or the sound of Leo's alarm blaring from his room. I woke up to the silence of the apartment, a silence that felt accusing. My new job was at a large, impersonal chain garage called Precision Auto. It was a world away from Sullivan's Auto. Here, I wasn't Mike Sullivan, the guy who knew every customer by name and the quirks of every car in the neighborhood. I was employee number 734. I clocked in, I was handed a work order by a manager half my age with a clipboard and an air of perpetual annoyance, and I worked on whatever car was assigned to me. There was no pride in it. The work was the same: busted transmissions, worn brake pads, faulty alternators, but the soul was gone. It was just a transaction. My time and expertise in exchange for a paycheck that was significantly smaller than what I was used to. The other mechanics were mostly younger guys, absorbed in their phones during breaks, talking about things I didn't understand. They weren't unfriendly, just distant. I was the old guy in the corner, the one who kept to himself. I ate my lunch alone in my car, a sad sandwich I'd packed that morning in my empty kitchen. I missed the easy camaraderie of my old shop, the way Dave would drop by with coffee, the way old Mr. Henderson from down the street would come in just to talk, not because anything was wrong with his ancient Buick. I had sold a house and a business, but I was quickly realizing I had also sold my community. The phone calls with Leo were my lifeline. In those early days, he called often, his voice buzzing with the energy of 1,000 new experiences. He described his dorm room, his roommate from California, the sheer size of the university library. He talked about his professors, the challenging classes, the beautiful autumn leaves on the Boston Common. I would sit on my second-hand sofa, the TV off, just listening, trying to picture his new world. "It's incredible, Dad," he'd say. "You're just as smart as any of them, Leo," I'd tell him, my voice full of a confidence I didn't always feel. "Smarter, even. Don't you forget that." "I know. It's just a lot to get used to." I sent him money when he needed it. $100 for books that weren't on the official list. $50 for a club fee. Another $100 for a trip the dorm was organizing. I never hesitated. I'd transfer the money from the dwindling funds I had left from the sale, and then eat cheap for the rest of the week. It felt good, in a way. It felt like I was still his father, still the provider, even from 500 miles away. It was the only part of my old identity I had left. But as September bled into October, the calls started to change. They became shorter, more hurried. The detailed descriptions of his new life were replaced with vague summaries. "How are things, kid?" I'd ask. "Busy, Dad." "So busy. Midterms are coming up. Drowning in homework." His story started to include names I didn't know and places I couldn't picture. There was a guy named Julian whose family had a place on Martha's Vineyard. There was a girl named Chloe who was planning a ski trip to Vermont for winter break. These were not just names, they were symbols of a world I had no access to, a world I had paid for him to enter. A faint, unfamiliar bitterness started to creep into the edges of my heart, a feeling I quickly pushed down. This was what I wanted for him. This was the point of it all. One night, he called while I was working late, trying to get a few hours of overtime. I sat in the grimy break room, the smell of burnt coffee thick in the air. "Hey Dad, quick question," he started, no preamble. "My laptop is acting up, it's really slow and I need it for a paper. A lot of the kids here have MacBooks. They're way better for the software we need for my design class." I knew what was coming. I looked at my bank account balance on my phone earlier that day. It was low. Dangerously low. The rent was due next week. "How much is one of those?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be painful. He told me the price. It was more than a month's rent. "Leo, that's a lot of money, son." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought he would understand. I thought he would say, "You're right, Dad, I'll make do." Instead, he let out an exasperated sigh. "I know it is, but it's an..." The mention of Julian, the faceless son of some wealthy man, was like a small jab to the ribs. "I'm not Julian's dad," I wanted to scream. "I don't have a house on the vineyard. I have a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat and my hands hurt all the time." But I didn't say any of that. The silence stretched. I could hear music and laughter in the background on his end. A party. He wasn't drowning in homework. "I'll see what I can do," I said, my voice flat. "Thanks, Dad. You're the best. Gotta go, professor's calling me over. Talk soon." He hung up before I could say goodbye. I sat there in the break room, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the drafty room. It was the first time I felt like an ATM machine. A means to an end. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to a pawn shop. I sold the set of German-made socket wrenches Emily had given me. The man behind the counter, a guy with tired eyes and a stained shirt, gave me a fraction of what they were worth. I didn't argue. I took the cash and walked out, feeling like I'd just sold a piece of my own soul. I wired the money to Leo the next morning with the message, "For the laptop. Work hard." His reply was a quick text, "THX Dad. You rock." Around the same time, I started to develop a cough. At first, it was just a dry tickle in my throat, the kind you get from dust or cold air. I blamed it on the new garage. It was poorly ventilated, and the air was always thick with chemical fumes and fine dust from sanding. I'd worked in garages my whole life, but maybe my lungs were finally starting to complain. I bought a bag of cough drops and tried to ignore it. But the cough didn't go away. It settled deep in my chest, a persistent, rattling presence. Sometimes it would wake me up at night, gasping for air. I started to feel a constant fatigue, a weariness that sleep couldn't fix. Walking up the single flight of stairs to my apartment left me winded. Dave noticed. He'd started making a point of coming to my apartment for our Friday night beers, since I never seemed to have the energy to go out anymore. "You sound terrible," he said one night, watching me as I tried to suppress a coughing fit. "You need to see a doctor, Mike." "It's just a chest cold," I wheezed, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. "It'll pass." "It's been a month." "That's not a cold, that's a squatter. It's moved in and is redecorating your lungs. Go to the doctor." "Doctors cost money, Dave," I said, the truth of it sharp and ugly. My insurance from the new job was terrible, with a deductible so high it was basically useless. I was living paycheck to paycheck, sometimes week to week. A doctor's visit was a luxury I couldn't afford. "So what? You're just going to cough yourself into an early grave?" "I'm fine," I insisted, annoyed by his persistence, but also terrified that he was right. The cough was a constant, humiliating reminder of my new circumstances. At work, I'd have to step away from a car to lean against a wall, trying to catch my breath. The younger guys would look at me with a mixture of pity and impatience. I felt old. I felt weak. The feeling of physical strength, of being a man who could lift an engine block, had been central to my identity. Now, a flight of stairs was my enemy. My conversations with Leo grew even more infrequent. I stopped telling him about my life, because there was nothing to tell. My days were a monotonous loop of work, eat, and sleep. I didn't want to burden him with my boring, difficult reality. And he, in turn, seemed to have less and less time for me. His stories were now entirely about his new life, a life that felt as distant and foreign as the moon. He talked about fraternity rush, about weekend trips I knew I wasn't funding, about restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my daily food budget. He was adapting. He was thriving. He was becoming one of them. And as he did, the gulf between us widened from a crack into a chasm. He didn't mean for it to happen. I knew that. But it was happening all the same. He was on a rocket ship to the stars, and I was the spent fuel stage, falling silently back to Earth. The breaking point came with Thanksgiving. It was the first major holiday since his mother had died that we weren't going to be together. For weeks, I'd held on to the idea of his visit like a drowning man clinging to a raft. I imagined picking him up from the airport, taking him to our favorite diner, maybe even driving by the old house. I pictured us sitting in my small apartment, eating a turkey I'd cook in my tiny oven. It wouldn't be the same, but we'd be together. I called him a week before the holiday to finalize the plans. "Hey, kid. Just wanted to see what time your flight gets in next Wednesday." There was a telling hesitation on the other end. "Oh. Hey, Dad. About that something came up." The cold knot of fear in my stomach, the one that had been living there for months, tightened. "What do you mean?" "Well, my friend Julian, the one I told you about. His family invited me to their place in Nantucket for Thanksgiving. It's a huge tradition for them, they get the whole extended family together. It's kind of a big deal, a great networking opportunity, you know. His dad's a pretty important guy." Nantucket. The word sounded like money. It sounded like everything I wasn't. "Thanksgiving is our tradition, Leo," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "It's family." I know, and I feel terrible," he said, but his voice lacked any real remorse. It was the slick, practiced tone of someone making a business decision. "But this is really important for my future. You always said to focus on my future. It would be rude to say no at this point. We'll do Christmas, for sure. It'll be a big one." I thought about the wrenches I'd sold. I thought about the emptiness of my apartment. I thought about the cough rattling in my lungs. And I felt something inside me begin to crack. "So you're choosing to spend Thanksgiving with a stranger's family instead of your own father?" "Dad, Don't be like that, he said, his tone shifting to annoyance. It's not a choice like that. It's a practical decision. You get that, right? You're the most practical guy I know. He was using my own supposed strengths against me. It was a brutally effective tactic. What should I tell Dave? I asked, my voice hollow. He was expecting you. It was a lie. I hadn't even talked to Dave about it. I was too afraid this would happen. Oh. Right. Well, just tell him I got swamped with a big project. He'll understand. He didn't get it. He didn't get that for people like me and Dave, holidays weren't about networking. They were about showing up. Fine, Leo, I said, the fight draining out of me. You have a good time in Nantucket. I could barely say the word. Great. Thanks for understanding, Dad. It'll be amazing. I'll text you pictures. Got to run. Bye. The line went dead. I stood in my silent apartment, the receiver still in my hand. He wasn't even going to pretend to feel bad. He had a new life, a new world, and, it seemed, a new family to go with it. I was just the guy who paid the bills. The guy who was expected to understand. I sank onto the sofa, the cheap cushions sighing under my weight. I wouldn't be telling Dave anything, because Dave would see the truth in my eyes and then he'd get angry on my behalf, and I didn't have the energy to deal with his anger on top of my own crushing disappointment. I would be spending Thanksgiving alone. For the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely alone. And as a racking cough tore through my body, leaving me breathless and dizzy, I had a terrifying thought: this is my life now. This is all that's left. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was the longest of my life. At work, the cheerful chatter about family plans and turkey recipes was a constant, grating reminder of my own isolation. I'd nod and offer a tight-lipped smile when someone asked about my plans, mumbling something vague about a quiet one this year. The lie was exhausting. It was easier to just retreat further into myself, to become the silent old guy in the corner, a ghost haunting the garage. On Wednesday night, the evening Leo would have flown in, I sat in my apartment and scrolled through social media, a habit I'd picked up just to feel connected to his life. And there it was. A picture posted by his friend Julian. It was a group of smiling, well-dressed college kids standing in front of a private jet. Leo was in the middle of them, arms slung around a pretty girl, a wide, carefree smile on his face. He was wearing a new, expensive-looking jacket I'd never seen before. The caption read, "Nantucket bound. Thanksgiving done right." I stared at the picture until the screen went dark. A private jet. Not a commercial flight he couldn't afford, but a private jet. He hadn't been invited to a family dinner. He'd been invited into an entirely different social stratosphere. The lie he told Methat he couldn't afford to come home was so blatant, so insulting, it stole the air from my lungs. The cough started again, a deep, barking sound that echoed in the empty room. I wasn't just left behind, I was being actively forgotten, my reality completely erased to make room for his shiny new one. Thanksgiving Day arrived, gray and cold. The smell of roasting turkey wafted up from the apartment below me. I had told Dave I was going to my cousin's house in Akron, another lie to keep his pity at bay. My Thanksgiving dinner consisted of a shrink-wrapped turkey sandwich and a can of flat soda from the vending machine downstairs. I ate it standing over the sink, staring out the window at the empty parking lot. I tried to feel angry, but all I felt was a profound, bone-deep sadness. The kind of sadness that is so heavy it feels like a physical illness. I thought about the house on Sycamore Street. I pictured Thanksgiving's past, Emily bustling around the kitchen, the smell of her sage stuffing filling every room, a young Leo, helping, by stealing olives from the relish tray, the comfortable chaos of family and friends. Those memories felt like they belonged to another man, a better, happier man whose life hadn't been sold off piece by piece. The weekend passed in a slow, gray crawl. On Monday, I forced myself back to work, my body feeling heavy and sluggish. The cough had taken up permanent residence in my chest, and a new symptom had joined it, a sharp pain in my side whenever I took a deep breath. I ignored it. I had to. The rent was due. It was a cold, wet Tuesday. I was trying to loosen a lug nut on a minivan, putting all my weight into the tire iron. Suddenly, the world tilted. The fluorescent lights of the garage ceiling swam before my eyes, turning into blurry streaks. A wave of dizziness washed over me, so intense I had to drop the iron and grab onto the tire to keep from falling. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The pain in my side sharpened into a white-hot poker. "Whoa, Mike. You okay?" One of the younger mechanics, a kid named Carlos, was looking at me with wide, concerned eyes. I tried to wave him off. "Fine. Just lost my grip." But I wasn't fine. The world was still spinning. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I couldn't get enough air. It felt like my lungs were 2 sizes too small for my chest. "You don't look fine," Carlos said, his voice firm. "You look like you're about to pass out. Sit down." He helped me over to a nearby stool. My legs felt like rubber. My manager, a man named Kevin who valued efficiency above all else, came striding over, his face a mask of annoyance. "What's the problem here, Sullivan? That vehicle was supposed to be done 10 minutes ago." "He's sick, man," Carlos said, stepping between us. "He can barely stand up." Kevin looked at me, his eyes making a quick, cold assessment. He wasn't seeing a person, he was seeing a broken piece of equipment that was slowing down his assembly line. "If you're sick, you need to go home," he said curtly. "I can't have you fainting on my floor. It's a liability." The word liability hit me harder than the dizziness. I had spent my life being the reliable one, the one people depended on. Now I was a problem. A risk. Carlos helped me to my car, my protests weak and useless. "You need to go to the emergency room, Mike," he said, his young face serious. "Don't be a tough guy. This looks bad." I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, the engine off, the cold seeping into my bones. Going to the ER meant facing the truth. It meant a bill I couldn't pay. It meant admitting that I was broken. But the pain in my chest was a relentless, terrifying drumbeat. I was scared. For the first time in a long time, I was truly, deeply scared. The emergency room was a special kind of hell. A symphony of beeping machines, crying children, and quiet, desperate suffering. After hours of waiting, I was finally seen. They took my blood, put me in a paper-thin gown, and wheeled me into a room for a chest X-ray. The technician was brisk and professional, her instructions echoing in the sterile, cold room. I sat on a gurney in a hallway, waiting for the results, feeling exposed and anonymous. A doctor, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind face, finally approached me, a file in her hand. She sat on a stool next to me. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice gentle. "We got the results of your X-ray. There's some significant inflammation and scarring on your lungs. Based on what you told me about your work history and your symptoms, I'm very concerned. We need to run some more tests, but my preliminary diagnosis is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. COPD. COPD. The letters hung in the air, foreign and menacing. I'd heard of it. It was a smoker's disease. "I don't smoke," I said, the words coming out as a croak. "It's not just from smoking," she explained patiently. "Long-term exposure to dust, chemical fumes, and other airborne irritants is a major cause. Years of working in a garage without proper ventilation, it does this kind of damage." My garage. My sanctuary. The place where I had built my life had also been slowly, silently poisoning me. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. COPD. It means your lungs are damaged, and that damage is permanent, she said, her honesty both brutal and necessary. It's a progressive disease, which means it will get worse over time. But we can manage it. With inhalers, medication, lifestyle changes. We can slow the progression and improve your quality of life. She kept talking, using words like bronchodilators and steroids and pulmonary rehabilitation. I heard the words, but they didn't quite connect. All I could think about was the cost. All I could feel was the floor falling out from under me. The most important thing, she said, her gaze steady and serious, is that you can't continue to do strenuous physical labor. And you absolutely cannot be in an environment with fumes and dust anymore. It will accelerate the disease dramatically. The room went silent. The beeping machines, the distant announcements over the PA system, it all faded away. The doctor's last sentence was a death sentence. Not for my life, but for my livelihood. For the only way of being I had ever known. I couldn't be a mechanic anymore. The one thing I was good at, the one skill I had, was now off limits. I was fired a week later. I tried to go back to work, armed with a doctor's note asking for light duty. Kevin, my manager, read the note, looked at me with cold, calculating eyes, and said, "We don't have light duty here, Sullivan. This is a garage. I need mechanics who can do the job." It was clinical. It was legal. It was ruthless. I was handed my final paycheck and shown the door. I was 51 years old, with a chronic illness, no job, no savings, and a son who thought I was the strongest guy he knew. The foundation I had so carefully demolished for his sake had now completely crumbled beneath my own feet. Desperation is a cold, lonely room. I spent a week in that room, the diagnosis and the job loss replaying in my mind on a loop. The bills were piling up on my kitchen counter, an angry stack of white and red envelopes. The first bill from the ER visit arrived. The number on it made me feel sick. I was drowning. There was only one person left to call. One lifeline I hadn't used yet. I had avoided it, resisted it, because asking him for help felt like the ultimate failure. It meant admitting that the sacrifice hadn't been a clean, noble act, but a catastrophic miscalculation. It meant showing him the ugly, messy truth. But I had no other choice. My hands were shaking as I dialed his number. It rang 4 times, and I was about to hang up when he finally answered, his voice breathless and annoyed. "Dad? I'm in the middle of a study session. Is this important?" I took a shaky breath. This was it. The moment of truth. "Leo," I started, my voice cracking. I need to talk to you. Something's happened." "What is it?" he asked, the impatience clear in his tone. I told him everything. I didn't hold back. I told him about the diagnosis. The COPD. The doctor's words. I told him I'd lost my job. I told him about the bills. I let the ugly, shameful truth spill out in a torrent of desperate words. For the first time in his life, I wasn't the strong father. I was just a scared, sick man who was out of options. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It stretched for an eternity. I could hear the murmur of other voices in the background. His study group. His new life. Finally, he spoke. And the words he chose would shatter what was left of my heart into a million pieces. "Dad, I don't know what to say," he began, his voice strained and distant. He sounded like a stranger. That's terrible. But I'm in the middle of finals. I can't just drop everything and come home." He paused, and I heard him take a breath, as if steeling himself. "I mean, you sold the house for this. For my education. For me to succeed. I can't fail. That would make it all for nothing, right?" I couldn't speak. I felt a numbness creeping through me. Look, he continued, his voice becoming more clinical, more detached, as if he were solving a problem in a textbook. Have you looked into state assistance programs? Disability? There must be resources for people in your situation. You've always been good at figuring things out. He said it like a compliment, but it felt like a dismissal. An abdication. And then came the final blow. The words that would echo in my mind for months to come. You're strong, Dad. You have to take care of yourself now. The line went quiet again, waiting for my response. But I had none. He had made it clear. My crisis was my problem. My sacrifice was now my burden alone. I was no longer his father, the man to turn to for help. I was an obstacle. A complication in his new, important life. I ended the call without saying another word. I just pressed the button on my phone and let the silence of the apartment rush back in. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone falling from my limp hand. I had set myself on fire to keep him warm, just as Dave had warned. And now that I was nothing but ash, he was complaining about the smoke. After the call ended, I didn't move. I just sat on the edge of the bed in the gray afternoon light, the phone lying on the cheap carpet where it had fallen. There was no rage, no fire, not even any tears. There was only a profound and terrifying emptiness. It felt as if Leo's words hadn't just broken my heart, but had scooped out everything inside of me, leaving a hollow shell behind. The man who had sold his life for his son's future had just been informed that his services were no longer required. He was an inconvenience. A problem to be managed by state assistance programs. The next few days, or was it a week, passed in a fog. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't check the mail. The stack of bills on the counter grew, a leaning tower of my failures. The small apartment became my cave. I'd sit on the sofa for hours, staring at a blank television screen, the sound of my own ragged breathing the only soundtrack. The cough was my constant companion, a physical manifestation of the poison in my life, both the fumes I had inhaled and the hope I had swallowed. Getting up to go to the kitchen felt like a monumental effort. I was shrinking, fading, becoming a ghost in the ruins of my own life. I probably would have stayed that way, slowly consumed by the dust and the silence, if it weren't for Dave Kowalski. He called a dozen times. I ignored every call. So, on a Thursday afternoon, he stopped calling and just showed up. I didn't answer the first knock. Or the second. But Dave is as stubborn as a rusted bolt. The third knock was a loud, insistent banging that shook the flimsy door in its frame. Mike. I know you're in there. Open this damn door or I'm calling the landlord and telling him you died. I can smell you from the hallway. His voice, loud and full of life, was a violent intrusion into my quiet misery. I didn't have the energy to fight him. I dragged myself to the door and unlocked it. He stood there, a big, solid presence in the dim hallway. He took one look at unshaven, wearing the same clothes for 3 days, my eyes hollow, and his face, which had been set in angry determination, softened into deep concern. He pushed past me into the apartment, his gaze sweeping over the disaster area, the overflowing trash can, the pile of bills, the dust on every surface. Jesus, Mike, he breathed out, his voice losing its bluster. What the hell happened to you? I just shrugged, a pathetic, helpless gesture, and shuffled back to the sofa. I didn't have any lies left in me. He didn't yell. He didn't say, "I told you so," though he had every right to. He just walked over to the counter, picked up the angriest-looking red-stamped envelope from the pile, the one from the hospital, and tore it open. He read it, his lips a thin, hard line. Then he picked up another, an eviction warning from the landlord. He looked from the papers to me, and all the pieces finally clicked into place for him. "You lost the job," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "And the cough, it's not just a cold." I shook my head, a fresh wave of coughing seizing me, bending me over. He waited for it to pass, his big hand hovering near my back, unsure of what to do. When I could finally breathe again, I told him. I told him everything. The COPD diagnosis. The doctor's orders. Getting fired. And then, the hardest part. I told him about the phone call with Leo. I recited his son's words, flat and emotionless, like a court reporter reading back testimony. When I finished, Dave stood in the middle of my ruined apartment and said nothing for a full minute. His face was a thundercloud. I saw a flicker of the rage I'd seen in my garage months ago, but it was different now. It was mixed with a profound sorrow. That ungrateful little, he cut himself off, running a hand through his hair. He walked over and sat down in the apartment's only other chair, a rickety thing I'd found on the curb. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked me straight in the eye. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm, like a general taking command of a losing battle. "Okay. This is what we're going to do." And just like that, the tide began to turn. Not with a great wave, but with a slow, laborious crawl. Dave took over. He spent the rest of the day on my phone, his voice a commanding rumble as he navigated the automated menus of state agencies and hospital billing departments. He sorted my bills into piles, urgent, screamingly urgent, and, we can ignore this for now. He went out and came back with 2 large bags of groceries and a prescription bag from the pharmacy. He made me eat a bowl of soup that was so hot it scalded my tongue, but it was the first real food I'd had in days. He dragged me to a community legal aid office. He sat with me in the waiting room of a county social services office. He helped me fill out the mountain of paperwork for unemployment, for disability, for a program that helped low-income patients with prescription costs. He was relentless, a force of nature, pulling me through the bureaucratic mud I would have drowned in on my own. He also dragged me to my first COPD support group meeting. It was in the basement of a local church, a circle of plastic chairs filled with people older than me, people who carried small oxygen tanks, people whose breath came in wheezes and whistles. I didn't want to be there. I felt like an imposter. But then they started talking. A woman named Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher, talked about the grief of not being able to garden anymore. A man named Frank, a former construction worker, talked about the frustration of not being able to play with his grandkids. They spoke of loss, of fear, of the daily humiliations of a body that had betrayed them. And for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. They weren't just talking about their lungs, they were talking about their lives. They understood. The most important thing I did, however, was something I stopped doing. I stopped calling Leo. After that final, soul-crushing conversation, a switch had been flipped inside me. My life had revolved around waiting for his calls, hoping for his approval, measuring my worth by his success. Now, the line was dead. Not just the phone line, but the line of expectation and hope that had tethered me to him. My silence wasn't an act of anger or punishment. It was an act of self-preservation. It was me, finally, letting go of the rope. I had to focus on my own survival. His world would keep spinning without me. It was time to see if mine could do the same. Slowly, painstakingly, I started to build a new life, a smaller, quieter one. I learned the rhythms of my new body. I learned to walk slowly, to pause on the stairs, to use the inhalers the state-funded clinic provided. The disability check started coming in, a meager amount that barely covered rent and food, but it was enough. It was a floor beneath which I could not fall. I spent most of my days in the apartment, reading books from the library, watching old movies. It was a Spartan existence, but it was stable. Yet, there was a void. I had spent my life as a man who does. A man who fixes. Now, I did nothing. I fixed nothing. My hands, which had once been so capable, now felt useless. The idleness was its own kind of sickness. One afternoon, a young woman who lived down the hall, a single mom named Sarah, was struggling with a wobbly wheel on her baby's stroller. I was on my way back from the library and saw her frustration. "Let me take a look," I offered, my voice a little rusty from disuse. She was hesitant, but let me. The problem was a loose bearing. It was a simple fix, something I could have done in my sleep a year ago. I took it back to my apartment and, using a couple of basic tools I'd kept, had it fixed in 10 minutes. My hands knew just what to do. The familiar feeling of diagnosing a problem and solving it with my own skill was like a sip of cool water in a desert. When I returned the stroller, Sarah was so grateful she tried to give me $20. "No, no," I said, holding up my hands. "It was nothing." "It's not nothing to me," she insisted. "I need this to get to work." "Thank you. Seriously. You're a lifesaver. My brother is always trying to fix things and he just makes them worse. They should have a class for people like him." She meant it as a joke, but the word class stuck in my mind. That night, I called Dave. "It's a crazy idea," I started. "Most of your ideas are crazy," he quipped. "What is it this time?" "The community center down on 85th Street, I said. "Do they have, like, a workshop? A wood shop or anything?" "I think so. An old one." "Why?" "I want to teach a class," I said, the words feeling both absurd and exhilarating. "A free one. Basic home and auto repair. For kids. For anyone who wants to learn how to fix something instead of throwing it away." There was a long pause on Dave's end. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mike," he said softly. "That's the best damn idea you've ever had." It took some convincing. The center's director was worried about liability, about my health. But Dave co-signed on the insurance, and I showed them my doctor's note, which approved light, instructional activity in a well-ventilated space. The old workshop was dusty and neglected, but the tools were solid. I spent a week cleaning it, tuning up the old equipment, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a year. My first class had 3 students, 2 surly-looking teenagers who had been volunteered by their probation officer, and a quiet young woman who wanted to learn to change her own oil. It was awkward at first. The kids slouched, their faces buried in their phones. But then I brought out a small lawnmower engine I'd salvaged from a dumpster. I took it apart, piece by piece, explaining what each part did. I showed them how the spark plug ignited the fuel, how the piston drove the crankshaft. I let them get their hands dirty. And then, a small miracle happened. One of the kids, a boy named Marcus, correctly identified a clogged carburetor. We cleaned it together. We reassembled the engine. I let him pull the cord. After 3 tries, the engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. The look on Marcus's face, a mixture of shock, pride, and pure, unadulterated joy, was something I hadn't seen since Leo had opened his acceptance letter. But this was different. This wasn't a victory I had paid for. It was one I had guided. I wasn't just a provider, I was a teacher. As the roar of that tiny engine filled the small workshop, I felt a flicker of my old self return. Not the man who owned Sullivan's Auto, but the man who knew how to fix things. The man who had value in his hands and in his head. I was still sick. I was still poor. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't a victim. I was building something new. For me. Months melted into a new kind of routine, one that I built for myself. Twice a week, I'd walk the 4 blocks to the community center, my breathing steady and measured. My class grew. The 2 teenagers, Marcus and Kevin, kept coming back, long after their mandatory hours were up. They brought their friends. The young woman who wanted to change her oil, Maria, became my unofficial teaching assistant. Soon, we had a waiting list. We fixed broken lamps, wobbly chairs, bicycles with slipped chains, and more small engines than I could count. We were a tiny island of repair in a throwaway world. The kids gave me a new name, Mr. Mike. To them, I wasn't a failure. I wasn't the guy who lost everything. I was the guy who knew how to make things work. They didn't care that my hands trembled sometimes, or that I had to pause to use my inhaler. They cared that I could show them the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. My role as a father had been based on providing a future. My new role was about providing a skill, something tangible and immediate. It was a different kind of provision, and in many ways, it felt more real. I stopped thinking about Leo every day. The sharp, searing pain of his betrayal had dulled into a scare, a permanent part of me, but one that no longer ached with every breath. I thought of him the way you think of a distant country you once visited, a place with a different language and different customs. The pride I once felt had been replaced by a quiet, sad detachment. I hoped he was doing well, in the same way you hope for good weather in a city you'll never see again. I had built a wall of silence, and it had become my sanctuary. It was a chilly Saturday in late spring, almost a year and a half since Leo had left for Boston. My class was in full swing. The workshop buzzed with the sounds of sanding, the cautious tapping of hammers, and the low murmur of instructions. I was showing Marcus how to properly gap a spark plug when the door to the workshop creaked open. I didn't look up at first, assuming it was the center's director. "Mr. Mike," a tentative voice said. It was Maria. She was standing by the door, her expression unreadable. "There's someone here to see you." I wiped my hands on a rag and looked past her. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the bright light of the hallway, was a figure. Tall, thin, and hesitant. As my eyes adjusted, the silhouette took shape. He was wearing jeans and a university sweatshirt that I knew I hadn't paid for. It was Leo. The workshop fell silent. The kids stopped what they were doing and stared, first at him, then at me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me all over again. He looked different. Older. Thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes. The carefree confidence I'd last seen in that picture on the private jet was gone, replaced by a deep, weary anxiety. He took a hesitant step into the room. His eyes scanned the workshop, the collection of broken things and the group of kids who now looked to me. His gaze finally landed on the small, sputtering engine Marcus was working on. Then, he looked at me. Really looked at me. He saw the changes, the weight I'd lost, the slight tremor in my hands, the easy way I leaned against the workbench to conserve my strength. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It sounded strange to hear that word in this place, my new place. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. My heart was a wild, frantic drum against my ribs. I didn't know what I was feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a dizzying mix of a dozen emotions, all fighting for dominance. "Can we talk?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. I looked at Marcus, who was watching us with wide, curious eyes. "Keep the throttle steady," I told him, my voice rougher than I intended. "I'll be right back." I walked out of the workshop, Leo following me. We stood in the empty, echoing hallway, the cheerful posters on the walls a stark contrast to the tension between us. We stood there for a full minute, two strangers who shared a history and a last name. He was the one who broke the silence. "I went to the apartment," he said. "The landlord told me you didn't live there anymore. He said you might be here." "I'm here," I said. A simple statement of fact. He flinched at my cold, flat tone. He seemed to be struggling for words, the easy confidence he once had completely gone. "Dad, I am so sorry." The words, when they finally came, felt small and inadequate, like trying to patch a hole in a dam with a piece of tape. "Sorry for what, Leo?" I asked, my voice still devoid of emotion. "For not calling. For not visiting. Or for telling a dying man he needed to take care of himself." The bluntness of my words hit him like a physical blow. He recoiled, his face pale. Tears welled up in his eyes, the first I'd seen since he was a little boy who had fallen off his bike. For everything, he choked out, the words broken by a sob. For all of it. I was a coward. I was selfish. I got so caught up in that world, in trying to be someone I wasn't, that I forgot who I was. I forgot who you were. He told me everything then, the story spilling out of him in a desperate, messy rush. He told me about the pressure, the constant feeling of being an imposter among the wealthy kids. He told me about how Julian and his friends had quietly dropped him when it became clear he couldn't keep up with their lifestyle. He'd been working 2 part-time jobs, barely sleeping, trying to maintain the facade he had built. He'd failed a class. He was on academic probation. The shiny future he'd chased had turned out to be a mirage. The phone call, he said, had been the moment he hit bottom, the moment he realized what a monster he'd become. He'd been too ashamed to call back. Too afraid to face the man he had so casually discarded. I listened, my arms crossed over my chest. I listened without interruption, my face a stone mask. I was no longer the father who would rush to soothe his son's pain. I was a man who had learned to live with his own. When he was done, his shoulders slumped in defeat, he looked at me, his eyes pleading. I know I don't deserve it, he whispered. But I came back to try and make things right. I got a job for the summer, back here in Cleveland. I want to help. I want my dad back. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The old me, the man from the house on Sycamore Street, would have pulled him into a hug. He would have said, "It's okay, son. We'll figure it out." But I was not that man anymore. That man was gone, burned away in the fire of his own sacrifice. I took a deep, rattling breath, the air whistling slightly in my damaged lungs. You can't have him back, Leo, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. That man doesn't exist anymore. You helped kill him. He visibly crumpled, a fresh wave of tears streaming down his face. I sold the house, I sold my business, I sold the memory of your mother, I continued, each word a carefully placed stone. But I didn't sell myself. Not forever. The man I am now, I had to build him from the wreckage. I had to do it alone. My love for you, Leo, is unconditional. It's in my DNA. I will always love you. But love isn't a blank check. It isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. And it is not an excuse for me to stop living my own life. I looked back through the window into the workshop, at the kids who were now cautiously starting to work again, glancing our way. My life is in there now, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. It's small, and it's not shiny. But it's mine. I'm not just a provider anymore. I'm Mr. Mike. And I like being him. I turned back to Leo. He was looking at me with a new understanding, a painful dawn of awareness in his eyes. He finally understood the true cost, not in dollars, but in identity. You want to make things right? I asked. He nodded mutely. It's not about money. I don't want your money. Making things right is not a transaction. It's a process. It's showing up. It's being present. It's work. I paused, then gestured with my head toward the workshop. Class starts at 10 every Saturday. The floor needs sweeping. A flicker of confusion, then comprehension, crossed his face. He understood. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't a warm embrace and a return to the past. It was an invitation. An invitation to start over, from the very bottom, on my terms, in my new world. It was a chance to build something new, together, not as a provider and a recipient, but as two men. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his expensive sweatshirt. He took a deep breath. And for the first time, he looked not like a scared kid, but like a man ready to face the consequences of his actions. Okay, Dad, he said, his voice still shaky but firm. Okay. He walked past me, into the workshop. He didn't look at anyone. He went to the corner, found the old broom and dustpan, and he started to sweep the floor. The kids in the class watched him for a moment, then, following my lead, they turned back to their projects. The sounds of work slowly filled the room again, the sanding, the hammering, the low hum of a small engine. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching my son sweep up the sawdust and metal filings of other people's broken things. It was a start. A long, difficult road stretched out ahead of us, a road of rebuilding trust, one small, humble action at a time. I didn't know if we would ever get back to where we were. Maybe we weren't supposed to. Maybe we were meant to build something different, something stronger, something that wasn't forged in sacrifice, but in mutual respect. I took one last look, then turned and walked back into the center of the room, back to my kids, back to my life. All right, Marcus, I said, my voice clear and steady. Let's see if we can get this thing to run.